Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. James's phone vibrated, cutting through the rare quiet in the small house. He looked at the screen and froze. A phone number he had not seen in a very long time. For a brief moment, James thought he must be mistaken. He had left that place long ago. He believed all ties had ended, that all responsibilities had closed along with the past. But no. The voice on the other end came immediately, urgent and dry. No greeting, no familiar pleasantries, only words held tightly back, as if the caller had been waiting for this moment far too long. James, do you remember the old project? James did not answer. He leaned lightly against the wall, his hand tightening around the phone. Things aren't going well. The voice continued, low but pressing. That project's files are being reviewed again. There's a chance it will be investigated. Some parties are even preparing to file a lawsuit. James closed his eyes for a brief moment. Names, numbers, meetings he thought had been buried suddenly rushed back. That project. He remembered it clearly. He had been the main person in charge. He had signed off on it. He had carried the final responsibility. We tried to handle it internally, the caller went on, the tension now evident in his voice. But some parts were never fully closed. Certain items are still under your name. James took a deep breath. The air in his chest suddenly felt heavy, as if the morning itself had collapsed inward. I left that place a long time ago, James said, his voice low and slow. I'm no longer involved. On the other end of the line, there was a few seconds of silence. Then came a sentence that stopped James in his tracks. Your name is still on the records. If this goes further, you can't stay out of it. The words fell quietly, no raised voice, no threat, but carried enough weight to block every possible exit. James looked out the door. The street in front of the house was still busy with people passing by. Life continued on, unaware that a vortex was quietly opening right beside it. He did not reply immediately, not because he didn't understand, but because he understood too well. If he went back, he would pull the past closer to Diep and Ly than ever before. If he didn't, that legal responsibility could still come after him, whether he wanted it to or not. James ended the call very slowly. The phone in his hand suddenly felt heavier than usual. He stood still in the empty house, for the first time clearly realizing that some responsibilities we believe are finished are merely waiting for the right moment to return. In the days that followed, James no longer felt the same sense of calm he once had. His phone vibrated more often, not constantly, not frantically enough to cause panic, but regularly, enough that each vibration made him glance at it by instinct. Short, dry messages, nearly identical in tone, asking how far he had thought it through, reminding him to review the old files, informing him that the process was moving in a direction that would not be easy to stop. James read them. Then he didn't reply right away. Some messages he left untouched until evening. Some calls he didn't answer at all, only watching the screen light up and then slowly go dark. Then the emails started coming. Addresses he believed no longer existed suddenly appeared in his inbox. At the top was the familiar word forwarded. Sender names stacked over one another, stretching into a chain in which he himself had once been a link. Attachments labeled with the old project's name appeared one by one. No noise, no pressure, just sitting there, waiting to be opened. James stared at the screen for a long time. The cursor hovered over one file, then moved to another, then stopped. He didn't click, but he knew very clearly. With just one click, The things he had tried so hard to close would reopen in a way that could not be undone. During those days, James began to feel very clearly that the pressure was no longer confined to paperwork. At first, it was only a vague sensation, as if something wasn't right, but not yet clear enough to be named. One afternoon, while taking Ly home after school, James briefly noticed a man standing across the street. The man wasn't looking directly at them, only leaning against an old motorbike, head lowered as if listening to a phone call. When James stopped the bike, the man turned his back and walked away. James tightened his grip on the handlebars more than usual. He told himself he was overthinking. But then it happened again. The same street, the same time of day, and once more, a figure standing at a distance, neither approaching nor leaving right away. James glanced into the rearview mirror. For a very brief moment, their eyes met. It wasn't a threatening look, just an empty one. Enough for James to understand that this presence was not a coincidence. James understood very well. When a problem begins to move beyond paperwork and touches real life, it is no longer just his problem alone. And from that moment on, James knew he no longer had much time to handle everything quietly, the way he had before. As for Diep, she also noticed the change in James. It didn't come from any single incident, but from very small details. So small that if you hadn't lived together long enough, you might not have noticed at all. James had grown quieter than before. Not the tired silence after a long day, but the kind of silence of someone holding something inside, something he hadn't yet found the words for. There were moments when he would pause mid-action, his gaze drifting away, as if he'd been pulled out of the present by a thought that hadn't yet closed. His phone appeared in his hand more often. James would glance at it quickly, then place it face down on the table. Not hurried, not secretive, but enough for Diep to sense that he didn't want it to be seen. Sometimes she heard him let out a very soft breath, so light that if she hadn't been standing nearby, she might have mistaken it for an ordinary deep breath. Once, Diep stood outside his study door longer than she meant to. The light from the computer screen spilled out, casting a cold, pale blue glow over James's face. He sat motionless at the desk, his back slightly hunched, hands resting on the keyboard but not typing. His eyes were fixed on the screen, tense enough that he forgot to blink. Diep didn't go in. She stood there a few more seconds, long enough to understand that this wasn't the familiar kind of fatigue. It was the unease of someone being pushed gradually into a corner, someone trying to find a way out of a problem he himself didn't yet know how to begin talking about. Diep gently tightened her hand on the doorframe, then quietly turned away, leaving James alone with the glowing screen and the things that still had no name. These changes weren't loud, but to Diep, they were clear enough. One evening, after Ly had fallen sound asleep, the house held only the two of them and the steady whir of the fan. Diep was folding clothes when she paused, looked up at James, and asked very softly, "Are you okay?" The question carried no suspicion, nor was it an interrogation. It was simply the way Diep always asked, as if checking whether he was tired today, whether he needed to rest earlier than usual. James didn't look at her. He answered almost immediately, his voice calm. "I'm fine. You should sleep early with Ly." The sentence was short, decisive, too short. Diep didn't ask again. She didn't press him. She didn't demand that he say what he wasn't ready to say. She lowered her head and continued folding the clothes, her movements just a little slower than before. Inside Diep, a very faint sense of unease began to spread. unclear in shape, unclear in cause. That night, after Ly had fallen sound asleep, the house sank into a very deep stillness. There were no more small footsteps running around, no more innocent questions interrupting the adults' conversations. Only the soft yellow light spilling across the living room, and the two of them sitting opposite each other, each holding their own silence. James was the first to speak. He didn't beat around the bush. He didn't try to avoid it either. Perhaps because he understood that the longer he waited, the heavier the truth would become. James talked about his old company, about the project he had once been in charge of. He spoke slowly, each sentence clear and deliberate, not just so Diep could understand more easily, but as if he himself was retracing each fragment in his own mind. He said that if things went further, he might be called in for questioning, that he might have to go back to give explanations. There were decisions back then that he had signed off on while things were still unfinished, not because he didn't know, but because he believed they could be corrected later. But there are things that, once your signature is placed on them, no longer belong to the original intention. Then he added quietly, "From now on, be more careful when you go out, okay?" Diep listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask questions. She didn't demand to know why this was resurfacing now. Her face remained calm, but the hands resting on her knees tightened slightly. When James finished speaking, the room fell silent again. That silence lingered, long enough for both of them to clearly hear their own breathing. Diep didn't respond right away. She looked down at the floor, then slowly turned her gaze toward the bedroom where Ly was sleeping. In her eyes there was no blame, no panic, only a very real concern, for the present and for the days ahead. Then Diep spoke, her voice soft but steady. "If this goes on..." She paused for a beat, not out of hesitation, but as if preparing herself for the question she was about to ask. "Can you still stay here?" There were no tears in the question, no reproach, but it struck directly at what James feared most, the very thing he had been trying to avoid since the first phone call came. James opened his mouth, then closed it again. He couldn't find an answer, because he knew this wasn't a question about work. It was a question about whether he could still keep this family intact when the past was slowly pulling him away from it, quietly, relentlessly, and leaving him no way out. James opened his laptop. The machine started up slowly, the screen gradually lighting up the dark room. Old folders appeared, project names, file names, numbers so familiar that his heart sank slightly. He scrolled through each line of titles, feeling as if he were rereading a part of his life he had tried to close off long ago. James's face grew heavier. The bluish light reflected in his eyes, revealing a fatigue he had tried to hide during the day. Not from the work itself, but from knowing exactly where he stood, right in front of a door that, once opened, would be very hard to close again. James rested his hands on the keyboard, then stopped. Outside, the night had fallen deep. In the next room, Diep and Ly were sleeping peacefully. James knew that if he moved forward, it would no longer be just his own matter. And it was precisely that peace that made his decision heavier than ever. The phone vibrated just as James closed his laptop. The sound was soft, but in the stillness of the late night, it rang out clearly enough to make him freeze. A new message. James opened it. Just one short line, no elaboration, no explanation. "If you do not cooperate, we will be forced to move the case in another direction." James stared at the screen. He understood very well what lay behind those words. Once that other direction was chosen, everything would no longer be within his control. He turned off the phone screen and stood up very slowly. James walked to the bedroom door. It was slightly ajar. The nightlight cast a gentle strip of light outward. Diep lay on her side, breathing evenly and deeply after a long day. Her face was so peaceful that James stopped longer than he had intended. On the bed beside her, Ly hugged a small pillow tightly to her chest, curling her body as if afraid something might break her sleep. James stood there, not stepping inside. He was afraid that even the smallest movement might awaken that fragile peace. He quietly closed the door, turned away, and stepped out into the yard, where night had fully fallen. The space outside was so still that he could clearly hear insects murmuring somewhere in the bushes. Yellow light spilled onto the old tiled ground, stretching his shadow into a thin, solitary line. James leaned against the railing and looked up at the moonless sky. The night breeze brushed past him, cool, but not enough to dispel the heavy weight pressing on his chest. He took out his phone, stared at the dark screen for a long moment, then slipped it back into his pocket, as if afraid that any sound might shatter this moment. Behind him was the small house where Diep and Ly were sleeping peacefully, and in front of him, darkness stretched on, silent, waiting, just like the path he was about to step into. If you've ever been pulled back by the past just as you were about to touch peace, leave a like as a sign of shared understanding. And if you want to know whether James can escape this legal entanglement, subscribe to follow the next episode.